There's currently a looming investigation into Jane Sanders and whether or not she committed bank fraud when she was the president of a college in Burlington, Vermont. Now, I've talked about before how this is nothing more than a political witch hunt that was initiated by a Donald Trump supporter who actually was the chair of his campaign. He is part of the Vermont Republican Party, and he just doesn't like Bernie Sanders. This is a tactic that he's used on political opponents before. So Brady Toensig contends that Jane Sanders supplied a bank with misleading information on a loan application that she submitted on behalf of the college she was president of, because she really wanted to get this loan, so she overestimated the amount of pledges she would receive from the school's donors. That's what he's contending. This isn't a case wherein Jane Sanders is being accused of committing bank fraud to personally enrich herself. She was doing this on behalf of the school, and again, the evidence, it's not really there as far as we know. But this hasn't stopped mainstream media outlets from smearing Bernie Sanders and Jane Sanders. And the reason why Bernie Sanders is looped into this investigation as well is because Brady Toensig, the individual who, again, initiated this investigation, alleged that Bernie Sanders used his power and position as a United States Senator to put pressure on the bank to push for this loan and approve this loan. So there's no evidence, again, for this. But the Vermont publication VTDigger actually published an article that essentially made up facts about the story in order to make us believe that the story and the investigation in general got a lot more serious. And even though it is serious, what they said was incorrect. So, Paul Heinz of 7 Days reports an advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders' family is disputing a report that federal authorities impaneled a grand jury in connection with a long-running investigation into a 2010 land deal orchestrated by his wife, Jane O'Mara Sanders. In a story published Sunday, VTDigger.org reported that the probe had progressed to the point that federal prosecutors had convened a grand jury, a step the news outlet suggested meant the feds were seeking indictments. Authorities have spent 2 years investigating whether during O'Mara Sanders' tenure as president of Burlington College, the now defunct institution overstated pledged donations to secure a bank loan. Former Burlington College board member Robin Lloyd told VTDigger that she testified before a grand jury last October at the federal courthouse in Burlington. She said that Paul Vandegraff, who heads the criminal division in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Vermont, questioned her for an hour about the college's attempts to secure pledges to buy a $10 million campus. In a statement issued to 7 days following publication of the VTDigger story, Sanders' family spokesman Jeff Weaver cast doubt on it. We have absolutely no reason to believe that there was a grand jury impaneled to examine Burlington College, Jane Sanders, or any aspect of Dr. Sanders' service as president of Burlington College, said Weaver, who was previously served as the senator's chief of staff and campaign manager. As best we can tell, the current news reports are simply recycling an account of a government interview of a witness from several months ago. Nothing new here. And I understand that Jeff Weaver is someone who a lot of people would view as a biased source since he's close to the Sanders family, but he's right here. There's no evidence that indictments are imminent. None. Now, since VTDigger clearly misrepresented the facts of this case in a pretty substantial way, they had to basically change a ton of details about the article. So they removed the word impaneled, which was cited multiple times. They changed the title from grand jury impaneled in Burlington College case to updated. Grand jury takes sworn testimony in Burlington College case. They also had to include Jeff Weaver's statement. They slapped on a big editor's note at the beginning and a notice that they issued a correction at the bottom. So, I mean, for a VTDigger, this is incredibly embarrassing. This is especially embarrassing for that journalist because it just shows that journalists are willing to jump on any news story, even if they have to embellish a little, if it means they get to smear Bernie Sanders. And this isn't the first time a news outlet exaggerated or downright fabricated claims about Bernie Sanders and this investigation in particular, because last July, I actually talked about how the Washington Post did something similar. They published an article implying that the investigation took a really serious turn when really nothing really changed besides a request for documents. They decided to opportunistically publish a story surrounding the investigation, and shortly after it was published, the main premise of the article was disproven. So they published an article talking about how prosecutors in this case wanted to subpoena Jane before a grand jury and potentially even Bernie, but the prosecutor only decided to request documents instead. The problem with that is it's completely false. The grand jury never made a decision between documents and Jane. They only had asked for the documents to begin with. So in their editor's note, they state an earlier version of this story quoted James C. Foley Jr., an attorney for an official with a Vermont bonding agency, as saying that his client was initially called to appear before a grand jury, but that prosecutors later agreed that documents alone would be sufficient. Foley clarified late Monday, however, that the grand jury subpoena required only that documents be turned over. The story has been updated. So if Jane Sanders isn't actually being called to appear before a grand jury, or if they hadn't even considered that they wanted to call her to have her appear before the grand jury, then they really have no story here. So after they had to issue that retraction, this is the new news that they were left with. They report a federal investigation of a land deal led by Jane Sanders, the wife and political advisor of Senator Bernie Sanders, has accelerated in recent months, with prosecutors hauling off more than a dozen boxes of records from the Vermont college she once ran and calling a state official to provide evidence for a grand jury, according to interviews and documents. So the big news is that the grand jury is requesting documents. That's not news. That's not a story. In any probe, of course it's the case that they're going to need documents. But nonetheless, the title of the article is Federal Prosecutors Step Up the Probe, because they want you to think that this is getting more serious. And while the case is actually serious, nobody is surprised that the grand jury is requesting documents. Are you kidding me? And it's not just that, the retraction itself is a problem, but there's more to this article that I take issue with. So they don't talk about the entirety of the issue. So they conveniently leave out really important aspects of the story. So they mention Brady Townsend twice, who is the individual who initiated this lawsuit. He petitioned the Justice Department to investigate Jane Sanders, but they made zero mentions about the role of Brady Townsend in the Vermont Republican Party and how he's accused countless public officials of corruption under frivolous and false pretenses. That's a huge component of the story because it sheds light on the motivations of the individual who initiated this investigation in the first place. How could you leave out that component of the story? It's huge. It's everything. Now, if you thought that the Washington Post was biased, which they are, well, VTDigger didn't even mention Brady Townsend's name one time. Now, if you're talking about the Bernie Sanders and Jane Sanders investigation, you can't not bring him up because it provides you with crucial context that you need. This is the definition of a political witch hunt started by a supporter of Donald Trump, who is a Republican, who is part of the Vermont Republican Party, who is an opponent to Bernie Sanders, who wants to handicap Bernie Sanders' campaign ahead of Trump's 2020 re-election effort. I've said this so many times. If you really want to critique Bernie, then you need to look at the policy positions for the time being, because there's no evidence that this investigation is going to go anywhere. Is it serious? Of course it's serious, and we have to take it seriously. We have to treat it as though it's a serious issue. But with that being said, you can't be misleading because you want this investigation to be more serious, because it is, and that goes both ways. I'm not going to downplay the significance of this investigation, because even though I think it's a political witch hunt, it's still serious, of course. But what is really important is the objective truth, and you can't get there without the facts, or you can't get there by misrepresenting the facts. So whenever you hear an article about this, then I think it is incumbent on the journalist who's reporting on it to discuss the origins of this case and how it was initiated by Brady Townsend, who is a Republican. He ran Donald Trump's Republican campaign and probably will want to run Donald Trump's Republican campaign in Vermont again in 2020. He has a vested interest in sparing Bernie. That's what this is about, and we have to be upfront about it.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.